You may remember, have noticed other places that Jesus does not ask superficial or casual questions. We never hear Jesus saying, "Oh, how are you doing?" Usually there's a point to his questions, and we have an example of that in today's gospel. Jesus was invited to the house of the Pharisee Simon, and a woman came and washed his feet with her tears and dried them with her hair, an amazing kind of a scene to think of, and then anointed his feet with an ointment. And while she's doing this, the Pharisee's kind of looking off like this. You know, you get those disapproving glance looks. And Jesus, recognizing that, asks the question, "Simon, do you see this woman?" You think, well, what's so big about that? Well, what's so big about that is that even though she is in front of him, he didn't really see her. What he saw was a sinner. That's it. And she was. She was a known sinner, but that's all she saw. We know that there was more to her than just that, because Jesus said she loved much. She desired for forgiveness. There was a longing in her heart to be reconciled, forgiven, healed, and she loved much because of it. How much Simon missed. And this Simon didn't see Jesus either. He missed who Jesus was. He invited Jesus into his home, but there seems to have been some hostility from the beginning, because he didn't greet him in the normal little side kiss thing that they do over there. They didn't wash his feet. They didn't anoint his head with oil. He didn't see Jesus. It seems as if he invited Jesus just to test him. How would you like to be invited to somebody's house to be tested? Oh, good, what a party. He didn't see, but Jesus did see. And it seems as if that we can be subject to that same kind of blindness, that same kind of malady, that we let our judgments and our bias blind us from seeing the people who are in front of us, seeing their goodness and seeing their heart. There's no end to the examples we could have. I'll just talk about a few. One is a story about, it's true as far as I know, what a woman was at the airport and she had to wait for her flight, so she went to this little cafe place and bought some cookies and some coffee and sat down. It was pretty crowded, so she asked kind of, the guy sitting there, "Can I sit at your table?" And he said, "Oh, sure, sit down." And so she sat down and started drinking her coffee and started reading her book. And then she takes a cookie, and then he takes a cookie. She thinks, "Wow, that's kind of rude." But then she just goes on. She's a nice person. She's not going to say anything. She takes another cookie, and he takes a cookie. Now she's getting really aggravated. Now, who does he think he is? Well, he could at least ask. And there's one cookie left, and she says, "Well, I'm going to see what he does here." He goes, reaches out, breaks the cookie in half, and nods to her and eats his cookie, and she eats the other half. And then it's time to her go for her flight, so she gets up and goes to the flight. And she gets on the plane and sits down, and she's just seething. He didn't even say thank you. Then she opened her purse to pull out her book, and there was her bag of cookies. And everything she thought about that guy, she all of a sudden realized she was guilty of doing. But isn't how that is sometimes? We get aggravated by other people's faults and failings and things to criticize, and they may well be true, but we don't want to look at our own. If you know something about that story in the first reading about David and Nathaniel, the prophet, David had committed adultery and murder, And Nathaniel went up to him and told him a story about it, kind of like a metaphorical story about something else. And David says, well, that guy ought to be killed who did that in the story. And then Nathaniel looked to him and says, and that man is you. We don't see sometimes our own faults and failings, but are much more at ease about condemning somebody else for what may well be wrong. But judgment and condemnation, you think we'd be a little more compassionate if we realized what we ourselves do. That's just one story. Second story is when I was leaving my former assignment in Terre Haute, Indiana. Some guy came up to me and says, well, Father, I got to admit I'm going to miss you, but I also have to admit that I'm surprised to be saying that. Like, well, thanks for that. What's that about? He said, when you came here, I wasn't going to like anybody because they weren't Father Martin, who was here before. No matter who it would have been, I wouldn't have liked them. And that was true for a while, but finally I gave in and started listening and find out who you were, and that was okay. Thanks for that. But it brings up for me how much it is that, and how many times it is that we can condemn, put off, criticize, stay away from people because they're not somebody else. They're not who we want them to be. And we miss who they are. And that's another kind of blindness. Do you see that person? No, because they're not the person I want to see. Open our eyes to see who is really there. That's what Jesus did. And the third thing is that sometimes we're blind to ourselves. We can get so down on ourselves and not see anything good. And we need somebody to believe in us. When I was on vacation, one of the reasons I went at the time I did and the place and where I did was that I was down in southern Indiana at our provincial headquarters, and there was a retreat house and other stuff down there. But I wanted to go at that time because the secretary who had been in the provincial office when I served in that office in administration was retiring. She had served the province for 30 plus years. I wanted to be there for her. And the reason I wanted to be there for her, because she was kind of a bright and cheery kind of an individual and always saw positive things. And at the time when I was there, I was a pastor of a parish as well as working in the provincial office. And the days I just come in dragging. We all have bad days, don't we? Yeah, there are some days that just kind of came in dragging and just wasn't measuring up according to my own standards and whatever. And I'd walk in, and every day Linda greeted me warmly and with some enthusiasm, and it kind of made me wonder if she saw more in me than I saw in myself. And don't we need people to believe in us, to see more in us than we see in ourselves? Do you see? Jesus asked, do you see the people who are there before you? Do you see and understand not just what is superficial, but do you see their heart? What it is that they struggle with, how it is that they suffer, how it is that they long and desire for more in their lives, what it is that and who it is that they love. That's what Jesus did. Jesus sees into our hearts. He sees what needs to be forgiven, and he forgives. And he sees what is good, and he affirms it. And he asks us to do the same.